They said she was a fool. When Cassandra Hartwell signed divorce papers without claiming a single dollar from her husband's $10 billion empire, the world called her weak. Jameson Aldridge, fintech mogul, darling of Wall Street, architect of what Forbes dubbed the most disruptive payment platform since PayPal, laughed all the way to his corner office, certain he'd executed the perfect escape. But Jamie forgot something crucial. Cassandra wasn't the fragile housewife he'd spent 7 years convincing her she'd become. She was the mind behind an artificial intelligence revolution that had made her $800 million before she turned 29. He just erased her name from history. 6 months later, Cass didn't simply return to fight. She landed at Teterboro Airport in a Gulfstream G650, owned by the most feared venture capitalist on the eastern seaboard, carrying evidence that would incinerate everything Jamie had built on stolen ground. This is the story of a woman who accepted nothing because she understood something her husband never could. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's just the exhale before the scream. But before we get there, we need to go back to the night it all began unraveling. The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue smelled like money. Italian leather, ozone from too many electronics, and the faint, metallic tang of recycled air 70 floors above Manhattan. January wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the temperature held at exactly 68 degrees. Controlled by systems Jamie had programmed himself, back when he still wrote code instead of just taking credit for it. Cass stood before those windows, watching Central Park spread below like a circuit board dusted with January snow. The city looked clean from up here, antiseptic, all the messy human parts too small to see. Behind her, ice clinked against crystal. Jamie sat on the Italian sofa they'd commissioned from Milan. Correction, the sofa he'd commissioned after informing her that her taste ran too academic for the aesthetic he was cultivating. He wasn't looking at her. His thumb scrolled across his phone screen, checking Tokyo markets, Hong Kong futures, anything more important than the conversation that was supposed to be ending their marriage. His voice cut through the silence like a scalpel through skin. My legal team drafted everything. $5 million, one-time payment. The beach house in the Hamptons. You always loved it there. Clean, simple, fair. Fair. The words sat in the air between them like something dead. Cass turned from the window. DA finally looked up, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man she'd met 9 years ago at TechCrunch Disrupt in San Francisco. He'd been nobody then. A laid-off product manager with a Linux laptop and a vision about democratizing finance that had made her heart race in ways she thought she'd outgrown after selling Prism Analytics. Back when she was still Cassandra Hartwell, Wunderkind, the woman MIT professors called once in a generation, the founder who'd made artificial intelligence feel human. That flicker died fast. His eyes now were like the windows behind her, expensive, transparent, cold. There's a non-disclosure agreement attached, standard stuff. You don't talk about Quantum Flow's internal operations. You don't discuss company strategy, and you definitely don't mention Vivian. There it was. The real reason for the NDA, wrapped in corporate language like barbed wire and silk. Vivian Kane, your chief marketing officer. The woman who's been warming your bed for the last 2 years while I was what? Playing housewife? Jamie set his phone down with the deliberate care of a man who'd practiced staying calm during board meetings when everything was on fire. Vivian is a strategic partner vital to our IPO timeline. We go public in 3 months, Cass. The underwriters are nervous enough without tabloid drama about my personal life. The narrative needs to be clean. Visionary founder, stable company, inevitable success. Your jealousy complicates that narrative. Jealousy, as if what she felt was anything that simple. The memories hit in fragments, sharp-edged and bitter. Meeting him at that conference, his booth tucked in a corner nobody visited, his pitch deck riddled with typos she'd offered to fix over coffee that turned into dinner, that turned into 3 a.m. conversations about changing the world. How he'd looked at her like she was the only person in the room who understood his vision. Because she did understand, better than he knew, better than he ever would. The way he'd taken her hand across the table at that Vietnamese restaurant in Soma and admitted he was terrified, that he'd failed twice before, that maybe he wasn't cut out for this. She'd believed in him. More than that, she'd believed in the version of himself he wanted to become. So when he'd asked her to step back from her own work, to help him build quantum flow, just until we get stable, she'd said yes. When he'd suggested she didn't need to take that partnership offer from Sequoia because we don't need their money if we're smart, she'd agreed. When the late nights turned into all-nighters and he'd appeared in their bedroom doorway at dawn, exhausted and lost, asking if she could just take a look at the authentication module because something wasn't working, she'd done more than look. She'd rebuilt the entire back-end architecture in 48 hours without sleep, her fingers flying across the keyboard like they had in the old days, the code flowing through her in that state of flow she'd thought she'd lost forever. She'd created something elegant, something beautiful, something that would scale to millions of transactions without breaking. And he'd kissed her forehead when it worked, called her his genius, his secret weapon, his good luck charm. Never his co-founder, never his partner, always his. Jamie's voice pulled her back to the present, sharp with impatience. Look, you can fight this if you want. Hire some cut-rate lawyer, drag this out for years while I bury you in legal fees. Skadden Arps bills $700 an hour, Cass, and they'll send 4 partners to every hearing. You haven't worked in 7 years. You sold your Hermes bags last month. Yes, I know about that. And I'm guessing you're about 3 months from selling jewelry to make rent wherever you're planning to land. The cruelty was casual, almost bored, like he was explaining market conditions to a slow analyst. Or you can sign, take the $5 million and the beach house, disappear quietly, keep whatever dignity you have left. Dignity. From the man who'd brought his mistress to their anniversary party last year, who'd introduced Vivian as his right hand, while Cass stood 3 feet away holding a champagne flute she wanted to smash against his perfect teeth. She walked to the coffee table where the document stack sat, blue folder embossed with the Skadden logo, Mont Blanc pen resting on top like an offering. Jamie leaned back and she saw it, the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was expecting the scene. The tears, the screaming, the desperate negotiation. Maybe he wanted it, needed it to confirm what he'd spent years trying to make her believe, that she was emotional, unstable, not built for the ruthless machinery of Silicon Valley success. Cass picked up the pen. It was heavy, obscenely expensive, the kind of pen men like Jamie used to sign deals that moved millions. She flipped to the final page without reading anything in between. Jamie's smirk deepened. He thought he'd won. Cass drew a single line through the asset division clause, another through the $5 million settlement, a third through the beach house provision. Her initials went next to each strike-through, sharp and deliberate. The smirk faltered. I don't want the beach house, Jamie. I don't want the money. I don't want anything you're offering. His spine straightened, confusion cracking through the boardroom mask. What are you talking about? I'm signing your divorce. I'm signing your NDA. But I'm striking every single financial provision. I'm leaving with exactly what I brought into this marriage, which was $800 million in a trust fund she'd never touched. Not that he needed to know her reasons for keeping that particular card close. What mattered was the gesture, the rejection of his framing, his narrative, his need to rewrite her as the grasping ex-wife. Jamie stood, the confusion shifting into something else. Not quite fear, but close. The look of a programmer who just spotted an error in code he thought was bulletproof. You're bluffing. You haven't earned $1 in 7 years, Cass. You have no savings, no prospects, no leverage. You think playing martyr will make me chase you? Beg you to come back? It won't. I'll watch you crash and burn, and I won't feel a thing." His voice had gone tight, the words coming faster, and Cass recognized the pattern from 1,000 product meetings, 1,000 late-night debugging sessions. Jamie talked fast when he was scared, when the variables weren't aligning the way his models predicted. She signed her name at the bottom of the decree, the pen scratching across expensive paper. Then she pulled her wedding ring off her finger, 4-carat Tiffany solitaire, flawless and cold as the man who'd given it to her, and set it on top of the blue folder with a soft click. "You can keep the money, Jamie. Every cent. You can keep this mausoleum, the Hamptons house, the Tesla, whatever else you've accumulated. You can definitely keep Vivian." She turned toward the private elevator, and his voice cracked across the space like a whip. "Cass." She didn't stop. "If you walk out that door with nothing, don't come crawling back when reality hits. I will destroy you. I'll make sure every firm in this city knows you're unemployable, unstable, a liability. You'll be lucky to get hired managing a Starbucks." The elevator doors opened with a hushed, pneumatic sigh. Cass stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, she caught one last glimpse of Jamie standing in the center of his perfect penthouse, scotch in hand, looking not like a victor, but like a man trying to figure out where the bug in his code was hiding. She made it to the lobby before the shaking started. The doorman, Marcus, who'd worked a building for 15 years and had always been kind, saw her face and simply nodded, asked if she needed a cab. She nodded back, not trusting her voice. The yellow cab smelled like pine air freshener and somebody's leftover curry. The driver didn't ask questions, just pulled into traffic when she gave him the Brooklyn address she'd memorized, but never said aloud before. As they crossed the bridge, Manhattan's lights spreading behind her like embers from a fire she just walked through, Cass let herself feel it. Not regret, not quite triumph, but something stranger. Relief mixed with terror, freedom tangled with freefall. She'd chosen this. Whatever came next, she'd chosen it. The studio apartment in Brooklyn Heights wasn't the worst place she could have landed. The worst would have been one of those basement units in Sunset Park where the ceiling dripped and the windows didn't open. This was merely depressing. 4th floor walk-up, narrow as a coffin, with a window that looked onto a brick wall belonging to the laundromat next door. The radiator hissed and clanked like it was trying to communicate in Morse code. The kitchenette was 3 appliances crammed into a space designed for 2. But it was hers. Paid for with money from selling the Hermes Birkin bag Jamie had given her for their 3rd anniversary, the Cartier tank watch from their 5th. The deposit and first month's rent had taken most of her liquid cash. The 2nd month had taken the rest. That was 3 months ago. Now it was April, and Cass sat at the wobbly IKEA table she'd assembled herself, satisfying in a way that surprised her, staring at her laptop screen. The bank balance glowed red like a warning light. $1,847.23. She'd applied for 37 jobs, executive assistant positions at tech firms that would have fought over her 9 years ago, office manager roles at companies she'd never heard of, copy editing gigs that paid by the word, even a receptionist opening at a dental practice in Tribeca, which had somehow felt like the absolute bottom. Every single rejection hit the same notes. Overqualified, extended employment gap, references unavailable. The HR speak translated easily enough. Why did you stop working? What were you doing all those years? Why should we trust someone who abandoned a successful career to play housewife? The Columbia art history degree that had once seemed like proof of her intellectual range now looked like evidence she'd never been serious. The 7-year gap labeled homemaker on her resume was a scarlet letter in a world that measured worth in LinkedIn endorsements and GitHub contributions. But the rejections weren't the worst part. The worst part was the search results. Cass typed her name into Google, already knowing what she'd find but unable to stop herself from checking. The way you can't stop tonguing a broken tooth. Page 6, 3 days ago. Gold digger who fled. Why Cassandra Hartwell abandoned tech mogul before IPO. The article cited anonymous sources close to Jameson Aldridge, claiming Cass had demanded $50 million in cash before the divorce, then vanished when he refused to pay. Claims she'd had a secret lover, gambling debts, a shopping addiction that had spiraled out of control. All lies. Precise, calculated, career-destroying lies. Daily Mail, last week. Friends say Aldridge's ex was mentally unstable, threatened to sabotage his company. This one included speculation that Cass had been fired from Prism Analytics before the sale, that the company's real founders had bought her out to avoid a scandal. Also lies. She'd built Prism from her dorm room, coded the first prototype in 3 months of sleepless nights, pitched to 73 investors before Maggie Whitmore said yes. The sale had been her choice, her timing, her negotiation. Business Insider, 2 weeks ago. The dangerous trend of tech wives claiming credit for husband's work. Cass wasn't named directly, but the subtext was nuclear, a pattern of delusional spouses trying to rewrite history, to steal valor from the men who'd actually built empires while they'd merely watched from the sidelines. The pattern was too clean to be accidental. Vivian Kane's fingerprints were all over this, the same PR genius who'd transformed Quantum Flow from another fintech startup to the company that will save the American economy in 18 months of strategic media placement. Jamie needed a narrative for the IPO roadshow, something that would satisfy conservative investors nervous about founder drama. The scorned, unstable ex-wife who tried to extort him made him look like a victim. Sympathetic, stable, a man who'd overcome personal chaos to build something great. Cass closed the laptop before she could spiral further. Her phone buzzed, another LinkedIn rejection, this one from a junior editor position at a trade publication covering enterprise software. Thank you for your interest, however. She put her head in her hands, the silence of the apartment pressing in. 4 floors below, the laundromat's machines hummed their endless cycle. Somewhere above, a neighbor's television leaked canned laughter through thin walls. Maybe Jamie was right. Maybe she was obsolete. She'd walked away from tech in 2017 when React was just gaining traction and Bitcoin was still a curiosity. Now the landscape had shifted so completely, she barely recognized the frameworks companies were hiring for. Her skills hadn't just aged, they'd fossilized. The knock on her door made her jump hard enough to bang her knee against the table leg. Nobody knocked here. Not the landlord, he texted. Not delivery drivers, they left packages in the lobby. Not neighbors, they didn't acknowledge each other's existence in that particularly New York way. Cass crept to the door, pulse hammering. Through the peephole, she saw a man who absolutely did not belong in this building. 3-piece charcoal suit that probably cost what she paid in rent. Silver hair combed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh. Military posture, leather briefcase, the kind of presence that made you stand straighter without realizing it. She opened the door with the chain still on. Cassandra Hartwell? The voice matched the suit. East Coast money, Ivy League education, consonants clipped with the precision of someone who'd argued before the Supreme Court. Who's asking? My name is Nathaniel Webb. I represent Quinn Emanuel. A mutual acquaintance has retained my services to locate you, which proved considerably more difficult than anticipated. You're quite good at disappearing when you choose to be. Quinn Emanuel. The firm that had eviscerated Uber in arbitration, that had taken on giants and made them bleed. Partners there didn't make house calls to Brooklyn walk-ups. I don't know anyone at Quinn Emanuel. Nathaniel's You know Margaret Whitmore. She's been searching for you for 3 months. May I come in, Ms. Hartwell? I promise this conversation will be worth the temporary discomfort of allowing a stranger into your personal space. Maggie. The name hit like voltage through water. Cass undid the chain with shaking hands, stepped back to let him enter. Nathaniel moved into the tiny apartment without any visible reaction to its size or condition. He didn't glance around with judgment or pity. He simply waited for her to close the door, then set his briefcase on the IKEA table with the care of someone handling evidence. "Why is Maggie Whitmore looking for me?" Nathaniel opened the briefcase with 2 precise clicks. "Because 3 months ago you signed away your rights to assets in a divorce settlement with Jamison Aldridge. Ms. Whitmore found that curious given your history. She knows you're not impulsive. She knows you're not a fool. So she asked herself a question. What would make Cassandra Hartwell, a woman who built and sold a company for $800 million, walk away from a marriage with nothing?" He pulled out a USB drive, set it on the table between them like a chess piece. "The answer she arrived at was troubling, so she hired my firm to investigate. What we found goes considerably beyond marital infidelity and wounded feelings. What we found, Ms. Hartwell, is systematic intellectual property theft on a scale that would make Theranos look like a rounding error." The room tilted. Cass gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. "I don't understand." "You will, but not here. Miss Whitmore is waiting at a location where we can speak freely and examine evidence without concern for surveillance. There's a car downstairs. I can give you 5 minutes to gather whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's on that drive." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, and she saw him recalculating, adjusting his approach like a lawyer who just realized evidence that the core intellectual property underlying quantum flow, the cascade validation protocol, the quantum-resistant encryption layer, the predictive fraud detection algorithms that make Jamie Aldridge look like a visionary, was created by you, Mrs. Aldridge. Not assisted by you, not inspired by you, created by you, coded by you, and stolen by your husband, who filed patents under his name while you were still married, in direct violation of California community property law. The words came from far away, like Nathaniel was speaking through water. "That's not possible. I helped him debug some code, sure, but the architecture, the foundation, was yours. Every line that matters. We have forensic analysts who've compared your work on Prism Analytics to Quantum Flow's codebase. 73% structural similarity, identical notation styles, variable naming conventions that match your signature patterns, and buried in the comments, your initials, CH. Check cascade validation for redundancy, CH. Optimize encryption if volume exceeds 10 million per day, CH. Cass sat down hard, the chair scraping against cheap linoleum. She remembered that night, October 2019. Jamie had come home at 2 a.m., his face gray with exhaustion and fear. The beta test had crashed spectacularly in front of their first major investor. Everything was broken. They were going to lose the funding round. He'd sat on the edge of their bed and asked if she could just take a quick look, see if maybe there was something obvious he was missing. She'd taken more than a quick look. She'd torn the entire system apart and rebuilt it from the ground up, working for 48 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the muscle memory of who she used to be. The code had poured out of her like something she'd been holding back for years. When it was done, when the system finally worked the way it was supposed to, Jamie had held her so tight she couldn't breathe and whispered that she'd saved him, saved everything. He'd filed the patent 6 weeks later, November 15th, 2019. She remembered because it was 2 days before her birthday, and he'd been distracted all through dinner, checking his phone, barely touching his food. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd said he was just stressed about the legal paperwork for the funding round. He'd been filing patents on her work, while she sat across the table planning his birthday surprise. "Miss Whitmore's car is waiting," Nathaniel's voice cut through the spiral. Cass looked up at him, this stranger who'd walked into her desperate little apartment with evidence of theft that rewrote her entire marriage. "Where is she?" "Her office, financial district, 20 minutes if traffic cooperates." Cass grabbed her coat, the cheap replacement she'd bought at a thrift store. The car pulled away from Brooklyn Heights, crossing back. He just watched her with the patient attention of someone who'd seen people process devastating information before and knew when to wait. The Whitmore Capitol building rose from the financial district like a monument to the mathematics of money. Sleek glass and steel, the kind of architecture that made declarations about power without saying a word. The elevator moved so smoothly Cass barely felt the acceleration as they shot toward the 48th floor. The doors opened directly into Maggie's office. Not a waiting room, not a reception area, just straight into the inner sanctum. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, the Statue of Liberty small and green in the distance. The furniture was minimal, expensive, chosen for function over flash. A single desk, 3 chairs, walls lined with bookshelves holding first editions, and startup pitch decks preserved like historical artifacts. And standing at the window with her back to the room, silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon, wearing an Armani pantsuit in charcoal gray, was the woman who'd believed in Cass when she was 24 years old, and everyone else had called her vision impossible. Margaret Whitmore turned, and her face was exactly as Cass remembered. Sharp cheekbones, pale blue eyes that missed nothing, the kind of beauty that came from bone structure and absolute confidence instead of youth. Cassandra, Nathaniel, thank you. Please give us the room. Nathaniel set his briefcase on the desk and left without a word. The door clicked shut with the finality of a vault closing. Maggie didn't move from the window. She just studied Cass with the same intensity she'd brought to their first meeting 9 years ago, when Cass had walked into this office with a laptop and a dream and 72 rejection letters from other investors. I know you cut contact because of Jamie. He told you I was toxic, didn't he? That I was threatened by his success, jealous of what you two were building together. Cass's throat closed. She nodded. He was good at that. Isolation. The slow poison of making you doubt everyone who might have told you the truth. Maggie crossed to her desk, pressed a button. A screen descended from the ceiling, and suddenly Cass was looking at code. Her code. Lines she recognized the way you'd recognize your own handwriting, your own voice. I've been watching Quantum Flow for 2 years. Something felt wrong. The timelines didn't make sense. Jamie's background was product management, solid, but not genius level. Yet suddenly he's filing patents on cryptographic innovations that should have taken a team of PhDs years to develop. So I hired people, forensic code analysts, the same team that helped bring down the Uber theft case, private investigators, intellectual property lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of fraud. The screen changed. Email threads, Git commit logs, patent applications with dates and names that made Cass's vision blur. Jameson Aldridge didn't just steal from you during the divorce, Cassandra. He married you to steal from you. We found communications between him and Vivienne Kane dating back to March 2018, 2 months before your wedding. A new image filled the screen. Email exchange, the text cold and clear. Jamie to Vivienne. She's the golden ticket. Once I extract what I need, I'll phase her out. The IP will be mine, the company will be mine, and she'll be too isolated to fight back. Vivienne to Jamie. Make sure she signs an NDA when you're done. Can't have her going to the press with bitter ex-wife stories. Another email, dated November 2019. Jamie to Vivienne. Cass just rebuilt the entire authentication module. Code is flawless. I'm filing the patent tomorrow under my name. She doesn't even realize what she created. Thinks she was just helping with debugging. Vivienne to Jamie. Perfect. Keep her focused on the house, the social calendar, anything but the company. The longer she stays away from tech, the easier this gets. Cass couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, or maybe she was spinning, or maybe the entire axis of her reality had just tilted into a new and terrible alignment. He didn't just betray you, Cassandra. He executed a 5-year plan to gaslight you into thinking you were irrelevant, while he built an empire on the foundation of your genius. Maggie's voice was steady, clinical, the tone of a surgeon describing a cancer they were about to cut out. Under California law, any intellectual property created during a marriage belongs to both spouses as community property. Jamie's patents are fraudulent, but more than that, we found something else. Something that changes everything. The screen shifted again. Technical analysis, system architecture diagrams, security protocols highlighted in red. The current version of quantum flow has a critical vulnerability. When transaction volume exceeds 50 million per day, the encryption layer you designed begins to degrade. On IPO day, when millions of users flood the system, it won't just crash, it will expose every piece of user data. Bank accounts, social security numbers, transaction histories. We're looking at the largest fintech data breach in history, all because Jamie tried to update your architecture without understanding the foundational mathematics. Dr. Theodore Grayson's name appeared at the bottom of the analysis. MIT professor, the man who taught half of Silicon Valley's security engineers everything they knew about cryptography. He didn't know. Jamie surrounded himself with yes-men in Vivian, who knows marketing but couldn't debug a calculator. Nobody dared tell him the foundation was rotting because he'd built a culture where questioning the visionary gets you fired. Cass found her voice, though it came out shredded. "Why are you showing me this?" Maggie finally moved from behind her desk, came to stand directly in front of Cass. Up close, she looked older than Cass remembered. Lines around her eyes, silver threading through hair that used to be darker. But her gaze was the same, that penetrating focus that had seen through Cass's nervous pitch to the iron underneath. "Because you have a choice to make. We can sue Jamie right now for the stolen IP, for the fraudulent patents, for the marital assets he concealed in offshore accounts. Yes, we found those too. Vivian's name is on half of them. We can file tomorrow, and within 6 months, you'll have a settlement. 50 million, maybe 100. He'll write a check to make you go away before the IPO, quietly fix the security flaw, and go on to become a billionaire." She paused, letting that option settle. "Or we can wait. Let the IPO proceed. Let him ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Let him stand in front of cameras and talk about his vision, his innovation, his genius. And the moment the market opens, we file an emergency injunction. Not for divorce money, but for intellectual property fraud and a public safety emergency. We prove the code is stolen and dangerous. We prove you're the only one who understands the architecture well enough to fix it. The stock will tank. The SEC will investigate. His investors will turn on him like sharks scenting blood." Cass stared at her, understanding blooming like something dark and necessary. "He'll lose everything, not just money, reputation, trust, the ability to ever work in this industry again. But more importantly, the world will know the truth. That Jameson Aldridge built his empire on the back of his wife's genius, then threw her away when he thought he didn't need her anymore." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. "There's a risk," Maggie continued. "If we let the IPO happen and that security flaw triggers, millions of people could have their data exposed." But she pulled up another document, and Cass recognized her own code, her own elegant solution. "You built a failsafe into the original architecture, a kill switch. If the system approaches critical failure, someone with root access can activate emergency protocols that shut everything down cleanly, generating a complete audit log in the process. You're the only person who knows the activation sequence." Cass's mind raced through the implications. She could monitor the system in real time on IPO day. If transaction volume approached the danger threshold, she could trigger the shutdown herself. No data breach, no civilian casualties, just a very public, very humiliating system failure that would prove Jamie had deployed unsafe code because he didn't understand what he'd stolen. "This is incredibly risky." "Yes. If I trigger that kill switch, Jamie will claim I sabotaged him." "Let him try. We have proof the failsafe was in your original code. You won't be sabotaging anything. You'll be activating emergency protocols he was too arrogant to understand. Maggie returned to her desk, pulled out a folder, set it in front of Cass. I won't lie to you. This path is brutal. Jamie will fight back with everything he has. He'll file countersuits. He'll weaponize the media. He'll try to destroy whatever reputation you have left. You'll need to be prepared for war. Real war, the kind that doesn't end until someone is completely defeated. Cass opened the folder. Legal strategies, evidence summaries, a timeline that stretched across 10 weeks of preparation leading up to IPO day in July. Why now? Why me? Because 7 years ago, I invested in Prism Analytics. Not because the algorithm was revolutionary, though it was. I invested because you walked into this office and told me you weren't asking for money. You were offering me the chance to be part of history. Maggie's voice went soft, the armor cracking just enough to show what was underneath. That's who you are, Cassandra. Not the woman who hides. Not the woman who accepts scraps. The woman who builds empires. Jamie tried to bury that person. I'm offering you the chance to prove she never died. Cass looked around the office, at the pitch decks on the shelves. Her own was there, she realized. Prism Analytics, 2016. Preserved like something valuable. I don't have anything to wear to a war, Maggie smiled, and it was the first genuine warmth Cass had seen since walking in. Nathaniel has already arranged a wardrobe consultant from Bergdorf Goodman. She arrives tomorrow morning. Quinn Emanuel's litigation team flies in tonight to begin your deposition preparation. We have 10 weeks to turn you back into the CEO you should have been. But first, you need to decide. Do you want justice or do you want revenge? Cass thought about the penthouse, about Jamie's smirk, about Vivian wearing the life that should have been hers like a costume. She thought about the articles calling her a gold digger, the job rejections, the studio apartment where she'd spent 3 months believing she deserved the fall. I want the truth. I want everyone to know who really built Quantum Flow. And I want Jamie to understand exactly what he threw away when he decided I was disposable. Then we start now. Maggie extended her hand across the desk. Cass took it, and the handshake felt like signing a contract written in something more permanent than ink. She'd accepted nothing in the divorce because she'd understood something Jamie never would. You can't steal what someone gives you freely, but you absolutely can reclaim what was taken by force. The war was just beginning, and this time Cass wasn't playing defense. The war room at Quinn Emanuel occupied the entire 42nd floor of their Midtown tower, configured like a surgical theater where careers went to be dissected. Floor-to-ceiling whiteboards covered 3 walls, already dense with timeline markers, evidence categories, and legal strategies mapped in different colored ink. The 4th wall was pure glass, overlooking the geometric chaos of Manhattan, a reminder that empires rose and fell while the city kept breathing. Cass stood at the threshold that first morning, coffee going cold in her hand, trying to reconcile this sterile battlefield with the cramped apartment she'd left 90 minutes ago. Nathaniel had sent a car at 6 a.m., the kind of punctuality that felt like a test. She'd passed by showing up dressed in the only professional outfit she still owned, a navy sheath dress from her Prism days that hung looser now, evidence of 3 months surviving on bodega sandwiches and anxiety. Miss Hartwell, come in. We don't have time to waste being intimidated. The woman who spoke was maybe 5'3" in heels that added 4 inches and subtracted any illusion of softness. Hannah Cross, according to the business card Nathaniel had provided, crisis management specialist. The woman who'd handled PR for whistleblowers going against Enron, for executives navigating congressional inquiries, for anyone brave or foolish enough to fight giants in public. Hannah's gaze traveled over Cass with the clinical efficiency of a jeweler appraising stones, seeing flaws, potential, the raw material she'd have to polish into something usable. We're going to rebuild you from scratch, not because there's anything wrong with who you are, but because Jameson Aldridge has spent the last 3 months convincing the world you're unstable, greedy, and irrelevant. We need to replace his narrative with truth, which is always harder than it sounds. Truth requires evidence. Evidence requires preparation. And preparation requires you to stop apologizing for taking up space. 3 other people occupied the room. Dr. Theodore Grayson sat at the head of the conference table, a man in his 50s with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades staring at code. Wire-rimmed glasses, MIT hoodie under a sport coat, the kind of professor who'd revolutionize cryptography while drinking cafeteria coffee and forgetting to sleep. Next to him, a younger woman with dark hair pulled into a ruthlessly efficient ponytail. Lena Martinez, associate attorney, Quinn Emanuel's youngest partner, and reportedly the sharpest cross-examiner to come through Harvard Law in a decade. And at the far end, Maggie sat with a tablet and the same focused calm she'd brought to every board meeting Cass had ever witnessed. Venture capitalists learned early to conserve emotional energy for moments that mattered. This mattered. Nathaniel closed the door, sealing them into the kind of silence that came from expensive soundproofing and serious stakes. 10 weeks until IPO day, July 15th, we have 170 hours of work to accomplish in the next 70 days, which means 12-hour sessions, 6 days a week. Sundays you rest because exhausted witnesses make mistakes. Questions before we begin? Cass set her coffee down, squared her shoulders. What's the goal here, specifically? Lena looked up from her legal pad, something like approval flickering across her face. Goal is threefold. 1. Establish beyond doubt that you created the core intellectual property underlying quantum flow. 2. Prove Jameson Aldridge knowingly committed patent fraud by filing under his name while married to you. 3. Demonstrate that his current implementation contains security flaws severe enough to warrant SEC intervention and emergency injunction. And the kill switch? My role on IPO day? We monitor transaction volume in real time. If the system approaches critical threshold, 28 million transactions based on Dr. Grayson's models, you activate fail-safe protocols. The system shuts down cleanly, generates audit logs proving the vulnerability, and we file our injunction while the stock exchange is still processing what happened. Dr. Grayson pulled up a screen on the display behind him. Lines of code Cass recognized like old scars. The elegant architecture she'd built in that fever dream of 48 sleepless hours. Your cascade validation protocol is beautiful work, Ms. Hartwell, truly elegant. But Aldridge's modifications introduced race conditions in the encryption handshake. At scale, under the load of an IPO launch, those race conditions will cascade into system-wide failure. He turned your safety mechanism into a time bomb by not understanding the mathematics underlying your design. The technical discussion grounded Cass in ways the legal strategy couldn't. This was her language, the syntax of problems and solutions she'd spoken fluently before Jamie convinced her she'd forgotten how. Walk me through the failure mode. I need to see exactly what happens when volume spikes. For the next 2 hours, she and Grayson went deep into the code, tracing execution paths, identifying the precise moment where Jamie's arrogant modifications would trigger catastrophic breakdown. Lena took notes, translating technical concepts into language judges and juries could parse. Hannah watched Cass, cataloging mannerisms, vocal patterns, the way she came alive when discussing her work. When they broke for lunch, catered salads nobody touched, Hannah cornered Cass by the windows. You light up when you talk about code. Your whole posture changes. That's what we need to capture in depositions, in media interviews, if it comes to that. Not the wronged wife angle, the brilliant engineer who built something revolutionary and watched someone else take credit. I don't want to do media. You won't have a choice once we file. Aldridge's PR team will go nuclear. We need you ready to fight back, which means media training starting next week. But first, we need to address the elephant in the room. Hannah pulled up her phone, showed Cass a Daily Mail article from that morning. New photos of Jamie and Vivian at some charity gala, looking powerful and untouchable. The caption speculated about wedding plans post-IPO. How does this make you feel? Cass studied the image. Vivian wore a dress Cass recognized, Valentino, from a collection she'd admired but Jamie had deemed too flashy for her. The irony was so perfect, it almost made her laugh. I feel like I'm looking at someone wearing a costume of my life, but it's not my life anymore. It never really was. Good. Hold on to that clarity, because Aldridge is going to try to make you emotional, unstable, the crazy ex-wife. Our job is to keep you grounded in facts, in your expertise, in the undeniable evidence of what you created. The afternoon shifted to deposition prep. Lena played the role of hostile attorney, hurling questions designed to rattle, confuse, provoke. Nathaniel sat to Cass's right, occasionally interjecting with objections, but mostly letting her struggle through answers that came out tangled and defensive. Ms. Hartwell, isn't it true you haven't written production code in 7 years? I helped Jamie debug. Yes or no, please. Have you personally deployed code to a production environment in the last 7 years? Not deployed, but So that's a no. Thank you for clarifying. Nathaniel called a halt after 40 minutes. Cass's hands were shaking, coffee and adrenaline mixing into something toxic. You're letting her control the narrative. She asks a narrow question, you give a narrow answer that makes you look incompetent. We need to reframe. Lena nodded, gentler now that the attack simulation had ended. When someone asks if you've deployed code recently, the answer is, I created the foundational architecture that quantum flow is built on. That code is currently running in production, processing millions of transactions daily. The fact that someone else deployed my work under their name is precisely why we're here. You take their weapon and turn it around. They ran the drill again, and again, and again. By the 5th iteration, Cass started finding her footing, started hearing the traps in seemingly innocent questions, started fighting back with the precision of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms defending technical decisions to investors who didn't understand the first thing about software engineering. Better, but you're still apologizing. Every third sentence starts with, I just, or I only, or I think maybe. Strip those out. You don't think maybe you created this technology. You know you did. Own it. The days blurred into a rhythm of controlled brutality. Mornings with Grayson, diving deeper into technical analysis, building the expert testimony that would prove her authorship beyond doubt. Afternoons with Lena, sharpening her deposition skills until she could parry hostile questions without flinching. Evenings with Hannah, learning to compress complex technical concepts into sound bites that wouldn't make journalists' eyes glaze over. By week 3, Cass could recite the evidence markers in her sleep, the git-commit timestamps showing her work at 3 a.m. on the nights Jamie claimed to be the sole developer. The email threads where Jamie asked her increasingly sophisticated technical questions he should have known the answers to if he'd actually written the underlying code. The Slack messages where his CTO deferred to Mrs. Aldridge's feedback on architectural decisions. We have 73 distinct pieces of evidence proving co-inventorship at minimum, outright authorship at best. But evidence isn't enough if you can't present it convincingly. Juries and judges believe people, not documents. They need to see you as credible, composed, someone whose expertise is self-evident. Week 4 brought the discovery phase. Quinn Emanuel's subpoenas hit quantum flow like coordinated strikes, demanding emails, code repositories, internal communications, anything that might reveal the truth buried under Jamie's carefully constructed mythology. His legal team at Skadden Arps fought back hard, filing motions to quash, claiming trade secrets and attorney-client privilege, doing everything possible to block access to evidence that would destroy their client. But Nathaniel had been doing this longer than Jamie had been in business. Every motion got countered with surgical precision, every privilege claim dissected for weaknesses. The judge, a no-nonsense former prosecutor named Catherine Brennan, who'd presided over the Oracle Google case, saw through the obstruction tactics and granted Quinn Emanuel sweeping discovery rights. When the documents started arriving, they came in bankers' boxes that filled an entire conference room. Lena and her team of associates began the archaeological work of sorting through gigabytes of data, looking for the smoking guns buried in routine corporate communication. They found the first one on day 23, an email from Jamie to his CTO, dated November 18, 2019. Subject line, Authentication Module. Don't touch anything in the auth code. It's perfect as is. Cass spent 2 days rebuilding the entire back end, and it's the most elegant solution I've seen. We deploy exactly as she wrote it. Lena brought it to the war room like a hunter presenting a kill. Cass read it 3 times, the words rearranging her understanding of everything that had come after. He'd known. Not just known her contribution was significant, he'd known it was essential, irreplaceable, the foundation of everything he planned to build. And he'd filed the patent under his name anyway, 3 days later. This is conspiracy to commit fraud. This isn't a mistake or an oversight. He explicitly acknowledged your authorship, then deliberately excluded you from the patent application. More emails surfaced over the following week, each one adding another layer to the prosecution case being built in parallel to the civil suit. Jamie to Vivian, discussing how to manage Cass's expectations about her role in the company. Jamie to his investors, describing himself as the sole technical visionary behind Quantum Flow's innovations. Jamie to his board, recommending they not bring Cass on as a consultant because she's been out of the game too long to add value. Every lie documented, time-stamped, preserved in the digital amber of corporate email systems designed to never forget anything. But the defense wasn't sitting idle. Week 5 brought Jamie's counteroffensive. His PR machine, led by Vivian, launched a coordinated media blitz that made the earlier smear campaign look restrained. Business Insider ran a feature on the dangerous trend of disgruntled spouses weaponizing IP law to extort successful founders. TechCrunch published an op-ed arguing that helping with code didn't constitute co-inventorship any more than editing someone's manuscript made you a co-author. And then the legal nuclear weapon dropped. Skadden Arps filed a $50 million defamation and tortious interference lawsuit against Cass personally, alleging she'd made false claims about her role in Quantum Flow's development, with the deliberate intent to sabotage the company's IPO and extract a financial settlement. The SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation, was designed for one purpose: to bury the target in legal fees until they couldn't afford to continue fighting. Jamie had effectively unlimited resources. Cass was living on Maggie's charity and the fumes of her trust fund. The math was designed to force surrender. Hannah brought Cass the news in person, found her in the war room at 9 p.m. on a Friday, still reviewing deposition transcripts because sleep had become something other people did. They filed $50 million in damages. They're alleging you orchestrated this entire thing to destroy Aldridge out of spite and jealousy. Discovery on both cases will be parallel, which means twice the depositions, twice the document production, twice the pressure. Cass set down her highlighter with hands that wanted to shake, but refused. Can we counter? We can, and we will. Anti-SLAP motions, sanctions for frivolous litigation, the whole arsenal. But Brennan won't dismiss this overnight. It'll drag for months, maybe through trial. Jamie's betting you'll crack under the pressure. He's going to lose that bet. Hannah's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. You sound certain. I am. Because Jamie's operating from the same playbook he's always used. Overwhelm with resources, outlast through attrition, count on the other side folding because fighting is too expensive and too painful. But he's miscalculated two things. Cass stood, moved to the whiteboard, picked up a marker. First, I'm not fighting alone. Maggie's funding this, which means Quinn Emanuel doesn't stop until we win or she tells them to. And Maggie doesn't lose. Second, every piece of discovery he demands from me just gives us more opportunity to put our evidence on the record. He wants depositions? Great. I'll sit there for 40 hours explaining in excruciating technical detail how I built the foundation of his company. He wants document production? Perfect. We'll bury him in my original code commits, my design specifications, my architectural decisions documented in emails he can't make disappear. She wrote on the board in sharp, decisive strokes. They wanted me broken. They got me rebuilt. Hannah photographed the quote with her phone. I'm using that. Not yet, but when the moment's right, that's our battle cry in 5 words. The following Monday brought a development nobody had anticipated. Maggie walked into the war room at 7 a.m. with a tablet and an expression that suggested she'd found something that changed the game board entirely. We have a walk-in. Former Quantum Flow employee, software engineer on the core platform team, wants to talk. Off the record, no subpoena, purely voluntary. He's scared and he's angry and he has receipts. The meeting happened in a neutral location, a conference room at the New York Public Library's Research Division, chosen because it was public enough to feel safe and private enough for candid conversation. Nathaniel handled the arrangements with the paranoia of someone who'd seen witnesses develop sudden amnesia before crucial testimony. The engineer's name was Marcus Chen, no relation to Maggie, a coincidence that had made the vetting process momentarily complicated. He was 28, Asian American, with the perpetual exhaustion of someone who'd been working startup hours for too many years without equity worth the sacrifice. He sat across from Cass, Nathaniel, and Lena with a messenger bag that looked like it had survived several laptop migrations. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd rehearsed this confession until the emotion had been compressed out. I joined Quantum Flow 18 months ago. Back-end engineering, worked directly on the transaction processing pipeline. First day, they assigned me to optimize the Cascade validation protocol. Gave me the code, told me it was proprietary, built by Aldridge himself, and not to touch the core logic, just improve performance at the margins. He pulled out a laptop, opened it to reveal screens of code. Took me about 6 hours to realize this wasn't written by Jamie Aldridge. The style was completely different from everything else in the codebase. Cleaner, more elegant, with documentation that actually explained the mathematical reasoning instead of just describing what functions did. I asked my team lead who really wrote this module. He laughed and said everyone knew Aldridge's wife had done the heavy lifting on the early architecture, but we weren't supposed to talk about it because of the divorce. Marcus's hands moved across the keyboard, pulling up commit histories, code comments, design documents. Here's the thing, the authentication system, the encryption layer, the fraud detection algorithms, all of it has the same signature style, same variable naming conventions, same commenting patterns, same elegant approach to solving complex problems. Then you look at Aldridge's commits, the stuff he personally checked in, and it's completely different. Messier, more brute force, filled with shortcuts that work but aren't optimal. He turned the laptop toward Cass. This is yours, isn't it? All of it. She looked at the screen, at code she'd written during that 48-hour marathon, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief, not quite vindication, but the simple relief of being seen. Yes, that's mine. I also figured you might want to know that about 3 months ago, Aldridge pushed an update to the encryption handshake, changed the timeout thresholds because he claimed the system was too conservative, throttling growth. I ran the numbers, That change introduces race conditions at scale. Under IPO-level traffic, the whole thing is going to cascade into failure. I tried to flag it, got told to trust the founder's vision, so I quit. Lena leaned forward, legal instincts activating. Are you willing to testify to this? That's why I'm here. I've got 3 job offers, I'm financially stable, and I'm tired of watching mediocre men take credit for brilliant work while the people who actually built things get erased. Yeah, I'll testify. Just promise me you're going to win, because if you don't, my career in fintech is over. Nathaniel's smile was predatory. We're going to win. The deposition prep intensified after Marcus signed on as an expert witness. Now they had corroboration from inside Quantum Flow itself, someone who could speak to the technical realities without the baggage of marital conflict. But Cass still needed to be flawless in her own testimony, needed to present as the undeniable author of work that had been stolen. Week 7 brought the wardrobe transformation. The consultant from Bergdorf Goodman arrived with a rolling rack of options, all chosen to communicate competence, authority, the visual language of someone who belonged in boardrooms making decisions worth millions. Cass stood in front of a mirror trying on a charcoal pantsuit that fit like it had been engineered rather than sewn, watching herself disappear into the person she used to be, or maybe becoming a new version entirely, not the startup wonderkind and not the invisible housewife, but something harder. Someone who'd been broken and had welded the pieces back together with steel instead of hope. The goal isn't to make you look rich. The goal is to make you look inevitable. Hannah circled her like a sculptor assessing marble. When you walk into a deposition, into a courtroom, eventually into the IPO confrontation, people need to look at you and think, of course she built this. Of course she's the architect. The clothes are armor, not decoration. They settled on 3 core outfits: navy suit for depositions, serious, professional, impossible to dismiss; charcoal suit for court appearances, authoritative without being aggressive; and for IPO day, if it came to that, white. Not ivory, not cream, but pure white. The color of new beginnings, of angels, of people who could afford to stand out because they had nothing left to hide. Cass wore the navy suit to her first major deposition, held in Skadden's Midtown offices with Jamie's entire legal team arrayed like an infantry battalion across the conference table. The lead attorney was a man named Richard Ashford, 65, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses in Palm Beach, and the casual cruelty of someone who'd made partner by destroying people for sport. He started gentle, almost avuncular, asking about her background, her education, her early career, establishing credibility before the attack. Cass had been warned this was standard. Lull the witness into comfort, then strike when they're relaxed. And when did you first meet Mr. Aldridge? September 2016, at TechCrunch Disrupt in San Francisco. What were you doing at a tech conference, given you'd already sold your company? Advising other founders. I still enjoyed the industry. But you weren't actively working in technology at that point, correct? Here was the trap. Answer yes, and she's already obsolete by the time she met Jamie. Answer no and contradict the timeline. I was transitioning from operational leadership to advisory roles. I just sold a company I'd run for 4 years. I was 28 years old. I wanted time to decide what came next before committing to another decade-long build. So it's fair to say you were, essentially, retired from active software development? Nathaniel's hand moved to object, but Cass got there first. No, that's not fair or accurate. I was selectively engaged rather than operationally committed. There's a significant difference. Ashford's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's talk about your marriage to Mr. Aldridge. When did the relationship begin? October 2016. We dated for 18 months before marrying in April 2018. And during that courtship, did you discuss your respective careers? Frequently. Jamie was passionate about building Quantum Flow. I supported that vision. Supported how, specifically? This was the minefield. Admit too much and she's claiming credit for everything. Admit too little and she undermines her own case. Initially through strategic advice, investor introductions, product feedback. As the technical challenges became more complex, through architectural consultation and eventually direct engineering contributions. Consultation, that's an interesting word. Can you clarify what you mean by direct engineering contributions? I wrote code, designed system architecture, solved technical problems that were blocking product development. Under Mr. Aldridge's direction? In collaboration with him, yes. So you were assisting with his project. Cass felt Nathaniel tense beside her, but she kept her voice level, her gaze steady on Ashford's face. I was building core technology that became the foundation of Quantum Flow's platform. Whether you characterize that as assistance or authorship is precisely what this litigation will determine. The deposition lasted 6 hours. Ashford probed every aspect of her technical claims, looking for inconsistencies, exaggerations, anything he could use to paint her as a bitter ex-wife rewriting history. Cass held her ground, deflecting traps, clarifying ambiguities, refusing to be cornered into absolutes that didn't reflect the complex reality of collaborative work that had become theft through deliberate exclusion. When it finally ended and Ashford's team filed out, Nathaniel let out a breath that suggested he'd been holding it for most of the session. You were exceptional, better than exceptional. You gave them nothing they can use. Cass slumped in her chair, the adrenaline crash hitting like a physical weight. I need to lie down for 3 days. You have 4 hours. We've got media training at 6. The media sessions were somehow worse than legal depositions. At least lawyers had to follow rules of evidence and procedure. Journalists could ask anything, frame questions with loaded assumptions, cut footage to create whatever narrative served their story. Hannah brought in a former CNN producer to run attack scenarios, teaching Cass how to bridge from hostile questions to her core message, how to control interviews without appearing evasive. Remember, the journalist isn't your friend. They want drama, conflict, emotion. Your job is to be relentlessly factual. When they ask how you feel about your ex-husband's betrayal, you don't talk about feelings. You talk about evidence. You talk about the mathematics of cryptographic protocols and the undeniable signature of your architectural decisions. By week 9, Cass could sit through simulated interviews without flinching, could take a question about her personal pain and pivot seamlessly to technical details that proved her case. The transformation wasn't comfortable. It felt like replacing parts of herself with something more functional and less human, but it was necessary. Then came the news that changed everything. Maggie walked into the war room on a Tuesday morning in late June, 10 days before the scheduled IPO, with an expression Cass had never seen before. Not triumph, exactly, but the grim satisfaction of someone who just confirmed their worst suspicions. We found the offshore accounts. Vivian's name is on half of them. Jamie's been moving money to Cayman shell companies for 18 months, hiding assets that should have been subject to community property division. We're looking at $300 million in concealed wealth. The number hung in the air like something physical. Lena pulled up documents on the main screen, showing the labyrinthine structure of transfers. Shell companies nested inside holding corporations, all designed to make money invisible to forensic accounting. Almost invisible. Whoever Jamie had hired to set this up was good, but Maggie's investigators were better. This changes our strategy. We're not just pursuing patent fraud anymore. This is securities fraud, tax evasion, fraudulent concealment of marital assets. The SEC is already investigating based on information we provided. If they find what we found, Jamie's not just losing the company, he's looking at federal charges. Cass stared at the account structures, at the dates showing transfers that had started 6 months before he'd asked for the divorce. He'd been planning this extraction for half a year, methodically moving assets beyond her reach while still sleeping in the same bed, still kissing her goodnight, still pretending their marriage had a future. Maggie's voice carried an edge Cass had rarely heard. He was so thorough. He was so certain he'd won, built elaborate structures to hide money, calculated every angle, planned years in advance. But all that cleverness, all that preparation, it was built on one fatal miscalculation, that you wouldn't have the resources or the will to fight back. He forgot that rage is a resource, and you, Cassandra, are very well resourced. Nathaniel began outlining next steps. They'd file an emergency motion to freeze assets pending the outcome of fraud investigation. They'd notify the SEC formally, triggering a mandatory review before the IPO could proceed. No. Everyone turned to look at Cass. She stood, moved to the window overlooking Manhattan, watching the city reshape itself in afternoon light. We don't stop the IPO. We let it happen. We let him get to the finish line, let him think he's won, and then we take everything. Hannah's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Now you're thinking like a strategist. The final 2 weeks became a countdown to war. Every piece had to be in position, every contingency planned. Cass spent hours with Dr. Grayson running scenarios for the kill switch activation, learning to monitor system metrics in real time, understanding exactly when to trigger the failsafe that would shut down Quantum Flow's platform before catastrophic failure. You'll see transaction volume climbing through different thresholds, 5 million, 10 million, 15. That's normal IPO activity. But when it hits 25 million and keeps accelerating, you're in the danger zone. At 28 million, the race conditions start triggering. You activate the shutdown sequence then, before data breach becomes inevitable. They practiced the activation sequence until Cass could do it blind, muscle memory taking over when cognitive function might fail under pressure. 4 specific commands entered in precise order, authenticated with keys only she possessed, triggering a cascade of protocols that would shut down every transaction, lock every database, and generate comprehensive audit logs proving system instability. This is going to be public, spectacular. The financial press will cover it live. When Quantum Flow crashes minutes after IPO, every analyst on Wall Street will be screaming for explanations. That's when we file the emergency injunction. That's when the truth comes out. Hannah had been coordinating with friendly journalists, seeding the ground for stories that would break the moment the system collapsed. Not speculation, not unnamed sources, but documented evidence of intellectual property theft and deliberate security negligence. The narrative would write itself once the first domino fell. Maggie arrived at the war room 3 days before IPO with 2 additions to their team. The first was a former SEC enforcement attorney who specialized in emergency injunctions and could argue their case before Judge Brennan with the kind of expertise that came from a decade putting white-collar criminals in prison. The second was a cybersecurity expert from the NSA's former Red Team, someone who could testify credibly about the severity of Quantum Flow's vulnerabilities. We're not just building a case anymore, we're building a prosecution. The night before IPO day, Cass couldn't sleep. She stood in her studio apartment, still hadn't moved despite Maggie's offers to find her something more suitable, and looked at the brick wall outside her window. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either she'd reclaim her legacy and destroy the man who'd stolen it, or she'd fail spectacularly on a stage visible to the entire financial world. Her phone buzzed. Text from Maggie. Car picks you up at 5:30 a.m. Wear the white suit. You're not just attending this IPO, you're ending it. Cass typed back, I'm ready. And the terrifying thing was, she meant it. The woman who'd signed divorce papers asking for nothing had been hollowed out, broken down, rebuilt into something harder than Jamie had ever imagined possible. She'd spent 10 weeks becoming the weapon that would destroy him. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was perfectly planned, mathematically precise, executed with the cold efficiency of someone who'd learned that silence wasn't surrender. It was just the exhale before the scream. The Gulfstream G650 descended through morning haze over Teterboro with a kind of mechanical grace that made physics look like artistry. Cass pressed her forehead against the oval window, watching New Jersey's industrial sprawl give way to the manicured chaos of private aviation infrastructure. The plane had departed from Boston at 4:30 a.m. Maggie owned a second office there, had flown up yesterday to handle West Coast investor calls personally, insisted Cass join her for the flight back because arriving separately sent the wrong message. We land together. We walk into battle together. Optics matter as much as evidence in fights like this. The white Armani suit fit like armor engineered by people who understood that clothes could be weapons. Hair pulled back in a sleek knot that wouldn't move even if hurricane winds hit. Minimal jewelry, just the diamond studs Maggie had loaned her. Investment-grade stones that caught light like captured stars. The overall effect was surgical, clinical. A woman who'd come to excise a cancer, not beg for scraps. Wheels touched tarmac at 5:53 a.m. The door opened onto air that smelled like jet fuel in imminent thunderstorms. Two black SUVs idled on the tarmac, engines running, Nathaniel visible through the tinted windows of the lead vehicle. Behind him, Dr. Grayson, with his laptop already open, monitoring God knew what metrics in real time. Hannah in the second SUV, phone pressed to her ear, probably coordinating with journalists who'd been promised the story of the decade if they positioned themselves correctly. Cass descended the stairs, and for a moment felt the absurdity of it all. 3 months ago, she'd been selling designer bags to make rent, and now she was stepping off a private jet about to detonate a $10 billion company on live television. Maggie appeared beside her, impossibly composed despite the early hour and the stakes that would define both their legacies. You know what you're walking into. The New York Stock Exchange at 9:30. Jameson ringing the opening bell, celebrating what he thinks is his greatest triumph. We'll be in the war room monitoring transaction volume, waiting for the threshold. When it hits, you activate the kill switch and we file the injunction. Simple, brutal, irreversible. And if something goes wrong, then we adapt. But nothing is going wrong, Cassandra. We've wargamed every scenario. We have contingency plans for the contingency plans. The only variable we can't control is whether you can execute when the moment comes. Cass climbed into the SUV, the leather seats still carrying Nathaniel's coffee smell, and the particular tension of lawyers preparing for war. The convoy pulled away from the private terminal, merging onto highways still relatively empty at this pre-dawn hour. Traffic would thicken as they approached Manhattan, but they'd allowed 90 minutes for a 40-minute drive. No room for delays. Nathaniel handed her a tablet showing CNBC's pre-market coverage. Analysts were already discussing Quantum Flow's IPO as the headline event of the day, potentially the quarter. Projected opening price, $48 per share after the lawsuit-driven markdown from the original 65. Market cap, $18 billion. Jamie's personal stake, $8 billion, give or take volatility. The screen cut to footage of Jamie arriving at the exchange an hour ago. Vivian on his arm in a red dress that screamed triumph. Reporters shouting questions he deflected with practiced charm. How do you respond to your ex-wife's allegations? Look, divorce is painful for everyone involved. I wish Cassandra nothing but the best. Today isn't about past relationships. It's about the future we're building for millions of users who deserve better financial infrastructure. The pivot was smooth, almost compassionate. Classic Jamie acknowledged the criticism just enough to seem reasonable, then redirect to higher ground where he controlled the narrative. Vivian beamed at his side, playing her role flawlessly. Hannah's voice crackled through the speaker system, connecting both vehicles. He's good, I'll give him that. The man knows how to work a camera. But in 4 hours, he's going to find out what happens when the cameras capture something he didn't script. They arrived at Quinn Emanuel's offices at 6:45. The war room had been transformed overnight into mission control for a surgical strike. 6 monitors lined one wall, each displaying different feeds: CNBC, Bloomberg, Fox Business, the NYSE's internal camera angles, Quantum Flow's system metrics dashboard that Dr. Grayson had somehow managed to access through what he'd vaguely described as technical arrangements, and a split screen showing the Southern District Courthouse where their legal team stood ready to file the moment the system collapsed. Lena was already present, looking like she hadn't slept but functioning on the kind of adrenaline that made sleep irrelevant. 2 associates flanked her, tablets open, documents queued for electronic filing the instant they got the signal. Judge Brennan is standing by. We've got a 90-minute window from system failure to emergency hearing. The SEC has been notified that a significant market event may require their immediate attention. They're not happy about the vagueness, but they're watching. Everything is positioned. Cass took her place at the command station, a desk facing the monitors, laptop configured with the kill switch protocols, 2 phones charged and ready. Dr. Grayson settled beside her, pulling up real-time analytics that showed Quantum Flow's transaction processing in granular detail. Market opens in 2 hours and 43 minutes. Based on modeling, we'll see initial volume spike around 9:40 as the first trades execute. If the IPO is successful, volume will accelerate through 10 a.m. Critical threshold of 28 million transactions will hit somewhere between 10, 15, and 10:30, assuming market response matches projections. Maggie distributed coffee in actual mugs instead of disposable cups. A small touch that somehow mattered, suggested this was serious enough to use the good china. The room settled into focused quiet, everyone checking their particular piece of the machinery, making sure every gear would turn when needed. Anna broke the silence at 7:30 with news that landed like a grenade. Skadden just filed an emergency motion. They're asking Judge Brennan to impose a gag order on us, prevent any public statements or media engagement related to the case. They're claiming we're planning to interfere with the IPO through improper publicity. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of anger. Brennan won't grant it. There's no basis. We haven't made any public statements beyond court filings. But the fact they're trying means Jamie knows something is coming. He's spooked. Good. Spooked people make mistakes. The morning crawled forward with the agonizing slowness of watching a timed detonation countdown. At 8:15, the monitors showed Jamie doing his final round of media interviews on the NYSE floor. Confident, relaxed, talking about democratizing finance and building the payment infrastructure for the next generation. Vivian stood just off camera, feeding him talking points through an earpiece, the perfect partnership of charisma and calculation. At 8:45, Cass's phone buzzed. Unknown number, but she recognized the pattern. Jamie's personal cell, the one he'd given her years ago during late-night debugging sessions when he needed her expertise immediately. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message on speaker so everyone could hear. His voice came through tight with something that might have been desperation disguised as anger. Cass, I know you're planning something. Whatever it is, stop. You're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to look bitter and delusional in front of the entire financial world. Take the settlement I offered. We can still negotiate. $50 million, the beach house, a consultancy agreement if you want to save face. But if you go through with whatever stunt you're planning, I will bury you. I'll make sure you never work in tech again. The message cut off. Time limit exceeded. The room stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then Lena started laughing, genuinely amused. He's terrified. Absolutely terrified. He just offered you $50 million to go away. That's not confidence, that's panic. Maggie checked her watch. 9:07. 23 minutes to opening bell. Everyone in position. Cass, you ready? She looked at the laptop screen, at the kill switch interface she'd practiced activating 200 times over the past 10 days. 4 commands, specific sequence, authentication keys only she possessed. Simple enough that muscle memory would carry her through even if conscious thought failed. I'm ready. At 9:15, the monitors showed the NYSE trading floor filling with bodies, energy building toward the ceremonial moment that would transform quantum flow from private company to public entity. Jamie stood on the balcony reserved for companies going public, surrounded by his executive team and board members, all of them performing the choreographed enthusiasm that IPO celebrations demanded. 9:25. Countdown graphics appeared on the financial news channels, analysts offering last-minute predictions about opening price momentum, whether quantum flow would surge or disappoint, what the lawsuit shadow meant for long-term valuation. 9:28. Jamie lifted the gavel, practiced the motion he'd probably rehearsed alone in front of mirrors. Vivian adjusted his tie with the casual intimacy of someone who'd earned the right to touch him in public. 9:29. Cass's hands hovered over the keyboard, every nerve ending alive and waiting. 9:30. The gavel came down with a crack audible through the television audio. Confetti cannons exploded, raining gold and silver streamers over the trading floor. The opening trades executed, Quantum Flow's ticker symbol appearing on the massive display screens. QNTM. Opening price, $48.37. Cheers erupted on the exchange floor. Jamie hugged Vivian, shook hands with his CFO, raised a champagne flute someone had materialized, the moment of triumph he'd orchestrated perfectly. Dr. Grayson's calm voice cut through the celebration bleeding from the monitors. Initial volume, 3.2 million transactions, within normal parameters. Now we watch the acceleration curve. 9:35. Volume, 5.8 million. Stock price ticking upward, 49.12, 49.40, breaking through 50. The market was responding positively, validating Jamie's vision, his leadership, his genius. 9:42. Volume, 9.1 million. Price, 51.25. Analysts on CNBC discussing whether this could hit 60 by noon, whether the lawsuit concerns had been overblown, whether Jamie Aldridge was about to become the next fintech billionaire. 9:53. Volume, 14.6 million. Price, 52.70. The trajectory was steeper than models had predicted. Success breeding more success, momentum building on itself in the self-fulfilling prophecy of market psychology. 10:04. Volume, 19.3 million. Price, 53.40. Still climbing. Dr. Grayson's voice carried a new edge. We're ahead of projected curve. At this acceleration rate, we hit critical threshold in approximately 12 minutes. Be ready. Cass flexed her fingers, rolled her shoulders, centering herself in the way she used to before major presentations. Everything she'd built over 10 weeks of preparation compressed into this moment. 10:11. Volume, 23.7 million. Price, 54.09. The champagne was still flowing on the NYSE floor, Jamie granting interviews to Bloomberg and Reuters, basking in validation. 10:14. Volume, 26.1 million. The system metrics on Grayson's monitor started showing yellow indicators, stress points in the architecture, race conditions beginning to manifest exactly where he'd predicted they would. Nothing critical yet, but the early warning signs of cascade failure building in the infrastructure. 28 million in approximately 90 seconds. Nathaniel moved to stand behind Cass, not hovering, but present. Maggie stepped up on her other side. Hannah had her phone ready, finger poised over send on pre-written messages to a dozen journalists. The transaction volume counter ticked forward with mechanical inevitability. 27 million, 27.5, 27.8. Now, Cassandra, execute now. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of surgery. First command, authentication override, proving she had root access privileges. Second command, emergency shutdown sequence initialization. Third command, audit log activation, capturing every system state for forensic analysis. Fourth command, cascade validation lockdown, freezing all transactions mid-processing. She pressed enter. For 3 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then every monitor showing Quantum Flow's internal metrics went red simultaneously. Transaction processing halted. User sessions suspended. The entire platform frozen in a state of controlled emergency shutdown that looked, to anyone watching from outside, like catastrophic system failure. Dr. Grayson leaned forward, reading the telemetry. Shutdown successful. Audit logs generating. No data breach. Clean emergency stop. And the system is broadcasting the failure state to every monitoring service in the financial sector. The monitors showing NYSE coverage captured the moment reality hit the trading floor. Confused looks, phones coming out, urgent conversations, then visible panic spreading like contagion through the crowd. On CNBC, the anchor interrupted an analyst mid-sentence. "We're getting reports of a major technical issue at Quantum Flow. The platform appears to have crashed. Trading on QNTM stock has been halted, pending clarification." The camera cut to the NYSE floor where Jamie's celebration had curdled into crisis. He was on his phone, face gone pale, while his CTO gestured frantically at a laptop showing error messages. Vivian stood frozen, the champagne flute still in her hand, smile locked in place like a death mask. Lena moved into action with the speed of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Filing emergency injunction now. Motion for temporary restraining order on all QNTM trading until security vulnerabilities can be assessed. Expert testimony from Dr. Grayson attached. Evidence of intellectual property fraud attached. Request for expedited hearing." The documents transmitted electronically to the Southern District Courthouse, time-stamped at 10:17 a.m. Within 90 seconds, Judge Brennan's clerk confirmed receipt and scheduled emergency hearing for 1 p.m. Hannah hit send on her media alerts. Subject line, "Quantum Flow founder sued for IP theft moments after IPO collapse." The story broke across financial news simultaneously. Bloomberg, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, all running with variations of the same devastating narrative. The woman who'd been dismissed as bitter ex-wife had just revealed herself as the architect whose stolen work was now failing spectacularly because the thief didn't understand the blueprints. At 10:20, the SEC issued a statement announcing immediate investigation into Quantum Flow's cybersecurity protocols and disclosure practices. At 10:23, the first class action lawsuit from investors hit federal court in Delaware. At 10:26, the underwriters who'd shepherded the IPO released a statement expressing serious concerns about due diligence failures. The monitors showed Jamie being escorted from the NYSE trading floor, not by security, but by what looked like FBI agents in dark suits carrying credentials. The Skadden legal team swarmed around him, already constructing defensive positions. But the body language told the story. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was triage. Maggie stood at the windows overlooking Manhattan, watching the city that had no idea a quiet woman in a Brooklyn apartment had just rewritten the day's financial history. Vivian Kane just resigned. Press release went out 2 minutes ago, citing personal reasons and wishing the company well. The rats are abandoning ship. Nathaniel's phone rang, Judge Brennan's clerk, confirming the emergency hearing would proceed at 1 p.m. as scheduled, that both parties were required to appear, that failure to appear would result in default judgment. "We need to prep testimony. Cass, you're going to have to explain technical details to a judge who passed the bar before the internet existed. Make it clear, make it compelling, Make it undeniable. The next 2 hours compressed into a blur of preparation. Lena walked Cass through the testimony structure, establish her credentials, explain the technology in accessible terms, demonstrate her authorship through specific technical signatures, reveal Jamie's modifications that had created the vulnerability. Dr. Grayson would provide expert corroboration. Marcus Chen, the engineer who'd walked in voluntarily, would testify to the internal knowledge at Quantum Flow that Cass had built the core systems. At 11:30, Cass changed into the Navy suit, different armor for a different battlefield. The white had served its purpose. Court required something that spoke the language of institutional authority rather than symbolic defiance. The convoy departed for the courthouse at noon, leaving enough buffer time for security screening and unexpected delays. The SUVs cut through midtown traffic that had somehow gotten worse in the 2 hours since the IPO collapse. Every taxi driver and delivery truck contributing to the city's perpetual arterial clog. They arrived at the Southern District Courthouse at 12:20. The steps were packed with journalists, camera crews, protesters who'd materialized with shocking speed, holding signs about corporate fraud and stolen labor. Someone had already printed "Justice for Cassandra" banners, though Cass had no idea how they'd organized so quickly. Hannah appeared at her elbow as they exited the SUV. "Don't stop for questions. Don't make any statements. Walk straight through to security. You speak in court, nowhere else. Understood?" The gauntlet up the courthouse steps felt like running through crossfire. Microphones thrust toward her face. Questions shouted over each other in an incomprehensible chorus. Cass kept her eyes forward, let Nathaniel and Lena clear the path, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Inside the courthouse, the marble and brass spoke of institutional permanence, of justice that moved slower than market crashes, but carried more weight. They cleared security, rode elevators to the 15th floor, entered the wood-paneled courtroom where Judge Catherine Brennan presided with the no-nonsense authority of someone who'd seen every trick lawyers could devise. Jamie was already seated at the defense table with 4 attorneys from Skadden, surrounding him like a human shield. He looked smaller than Cass remembered, diminished somehow by the overhead fluorescent lights and the institutional setting that stripped away the Silicon Valley glamour he'd cultivated so carefully. When his eyes met hers across the courtroom, she saw something she'd never seen before in that face. Fear. Pure, undiluted recognition that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. Judge Brennan entered at exactly 1 p.m., punctual to the second. Everyone stood, then sat when instructed. The formalities of court, case numbers, appearances entered into record, preliminary statements, felt almost surreal after the chaos of the morning. Brennan cut through procedure with the efficiency of someone who'd cleared a docket to accommodate this emergency. "I've reviewed the pleadings filed this morning. Ms. Hartwell, your attorney claims you created substantial intellectual property that Mr. Aldridge fraudulently patented under his sole name. You further claim his modifications to your work have created a public safety hazard that manifested this morning in catastrophic system failure during a public offering. Those are serious allegations. I'm going to hear testimony now, and I expect technical explanations in English, not jargon. Counselor Webb, call your first witness." Cass took the stand, raised her right hand, swore to tell truth that had been suppressed for too long. Nathaniel led her through the foundation, her credentials, her history, the timeline of meeting Jamie and becoming involved with Quantum Flow's development. "Ms. Hartwell, in your own words, please describe your contribution to the technology underlying Quantum Flow's platform." This was the moment 10 weeks of preparation had built toward, the chance to tell her story, not to hostile depositions or corporate lawyers, but to a judge whose only loyalty was to factual accuracy. "I designed and implemented the Cascade Validation Protocol that processes every transaction on Quantum Flow's platform. I created the quantum-resistant encryption layer that protects user data. I built the predictive fraud detection algorithms that identify suspicious activity. These weren't minor contributions or helpful suggestions. These were fundamental architectural decisions that required deep expertise in cryptographic mathematics, distributed systems design, and financial transaction processing. She walked through specific technical details, pointing to code samples displayed on screens, explaining her signature approaches to solving complex problems. The way she structured error handling, the variable naming conventions she developed during her Prism Analytics days, the commenting style that documented not just what the code did, but why it did it that way. This is my work, not inspired by my work, not improved from my suggestions. My work, created during 48 hours in October 2019, when Mr. Aldridge's initial implementation had failed, and he needed someone who actually understood the underlying mathematics to rebuild it correctly. Nathaniel introduced the email evidence, Jamie to his CTO, explicitly acknowledging Cass's authorship, Jamie to investors, claiming sole technical vision. The contradictions stacked like stones, building a wall of undeniable fraud. And the system failure this morning, can you explain what caused that? Mr. Aldridge modified my encryption handshake implementation, changing timeout thresholds because he thought the system was too conservative. That change introduced race conditions that cascade into failure under high-volume load. I designed the original architecture with specific safety margins for exactly this reason. He removed those margins without understanding why they existed, creating a vulnerability that would expose millions of users' financial data. This morning, as transaction volume approached critical levels, I activated emergency fail-safe protocols I'd built into the original design. The system shut down cleanly, preventing data breach, generating comprehensive audit logs that document the vulnerability. So you shut down Quantum Flow's platform deliberately? I activated safety mechanisms designed to prevent catastrophic failure. Mr. Aldridge deployed unsafe code because he didn't understand the technology he'd stolen. I prevented that negligence from harming millions of innocent users. The cross-examination came from Richard Ashford, the Skadden partner who'd led her deposition. He tried to paint her as saboteur, bitter ex-wife destroying her former husband's success out of spite. But Judge Brennan shut down speculation quickly, demanded he focus on technical facts. Mr. Ashford, I don't care about marital drama. I care about whether this woman created technology and whether your client lied about it. Stick to evidence. Dr. Grayson's testimony provided expert validation. Marcus Chen described the internal knowledge at Quantum Flow that everyone knew Cass had built the core systems, but were instructed never to acknowledge it publicly. The case built itself through accumulated weight of proof. At 3:40, Judge Brennan called a 15-minute recess. When she returned, her expression suggested she'd reached conclusions that wouldn't favor Skadden's $400 an hour arguments. I'm issuing a temporary restraining order freezing all trading in Quantum Flow stock pending resolution of the intellectual property dispute. I'm ordering immediate forensic examination of the company's codebase by a court-appointed neutral expert. And I'm scheduling a preliminary injunction hearing for 2 weeks from today, where we'll determine whether Ms. Hartwell has demonstrated sufficient likelihood of success on the merits to warrant further relief. She looked directly at Jamie. Mr. Aldridge, I strongly suggest you consult with your attorneys about settlement options. If even half of what I've heard today is accurate, you're facing not just civil liability, but potential criminal charges for patent fraud, securities fraud, and fraudulent concealment of marital assets. The SEC and FBI are watching this case closely. You'd be wise to resolve it before they finish their investigations. The gavel came down. Court adjourned. The immediate aftermath played out in legal technicalities and media feeding frenzy. Cass gave a brief statement on the courthouse steps, carefully scripted by Hannah, focused on protecting user security and ensuring proper credit for innovation. No gloating, no personal attacks, just calm insistence on truth and accountability. The financial networks ran her statement on loop, dissecting every word, comparing it to Jamie's earlier interviews. The contrast was devastating. His smooth deflections versus her specific technical testimony, his charm versus her expertise, his narrative control versus her documented evidence. By 6 p.m., Quantum Flow's board had called an emergency meeting. By 7:30, they'd voted unanimously to remove Jamie as CEO. By 8:15, Vivian's social media had gone dark, her Wikipedia page already being edited to remove association with the company. The settlement negotiations began 3 weeks later in a conference room at Quinn Emanuel that felt more like an execution chamber than a mediation space. Jamie sat across from Cass, diminished in ways that went beyond the weight he'd lost or the circles under his eyes. His legal team had been replaced. Skadden had withdrawn, citing conflicts of interest, leaving him with a solo practitioner who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. Nathaniel laid out the terms Maggie had authorized. Full public admission that Ms. Hartwell co-created Quantum Flow's core technology. Transfer of all patents to joint ownership, 50-50. You resign from the board immediately. Payment of $500 million for fraud damages, and no non-disclosure agreement. Ms. Hartwell retains the right to tell her story however she chooses. Jamie's attorney started to object, but Jamie raised a hand to stop him. If I admit this, I'm confessing securities fraud. I could go to prison. Lena leaned forward, voice carrying the weight of federal prosecution waiting in the wings. The SEC is building their case whether you settle with us or not. The FBI has already interviewed witnesses. You're going to face consequences regardless. The question is whether you cooperate, show remorse, give prosecutors reasons to recommend leniency, or whether you fight and force them to make an example of you. Silence stretched across the table. Through the windows, Manhattan glittered in late afternoon sun, the city that had watched Jamie rise and was now watching him fall. There's more. We have evidence Vivian Kane knew about the code theft from the beginning. Her emails show she helped orchestrate the gaslighting campaign. She's currently negotiating her own deal with prosecutors. If you don't settle, you face this alone while she walks free. The betrayal registered in Jamie's eyes, something crumbling behind the last facade of control. He looked at Cass directly for the first time since entering the room. I didn't think. You meant exactly what you did. You just didn't expect consequences. Her voice carried no anger, no satisfaction, just the plain statement of causation and effect. Actions have results. Theft gets punished. The universe bends toward justice when people with resources decide to enforce it. Jamie signed the settlement agreement at 4:17 p.m. on a Thursday in August, effectively ending his career as a tech founder and beginning his transformation into a cautionary tale about hubris and fraud. 6 months later, Cass stood in the executive suite of what had been rebranded Cascade Systems, looking out at the harbor view from her corner office. The board had appointed her CEO after the settlement cleared. The investors who'd backed Jamie pivoted seamlessly to backing the person who'd actually built the technology they'd valued at billions. A young engineer knocked tentatively on the open door, maybe 25 years old, carrying a laptop and the nervous energy of someone who'd prepared extensively for this moment. Ms. Hartwell, I'm stuck on the authentication module. The Cascade validation is throwing errors I don't understand. Could you help? Cass smiled, recognizing her younger self in that mixture of competence and uncertainty. Show me what you've got. They bent over the laptop together, Cass explaining the logic flow, pointing out the subtle interdependencies that made the code work. Not just fixing, but teaching. The engineer's face lit up with understanding, that moment when complex systems suddenly resolve into clarity. I see it now. Thank you, Ms. Hartwell. This is really beautiful code. It should be. I've been perfecting this approach for 15 years. And you can call me Cass. After the engineer left, Cass stood alone in her office. On the wall hung the patents in minimalist frames, each one bearing two names now, Cassandra Hartwell and Jameson Aldridge. The court-ordered truth preserved in legal documents. She'd insisted on keeping both names when Nathaniel suggested they could probably get Jamie's removed entirely. But that felt like rewriting history instead of correcting it. What mattered wasn't erasing him. What mattered was ensuring her name appeared at all. Her phone buzzed. Text from Maggie. Board dinner tonight, 7 at per se. We're celebrating the quarterly numbers. Try to look surprised when we announce the bonus. Cass looked out at Manhattan spreading below, the same view Jamie had commanded from his penthouse while planning her erasure. But the view meant something different now. Not domination, but participation. Not conquest, but contribution. Sometimes walking away with empty hands is the only way to prove your hands built everything that mattered. And sometimes the bottom isn't the end of the story. It's just the foundation you need to build the empire you were always meant to rule.